So, good evening, everyone. So, this will be our first discussion in the subject, the child and adolescent learners and learning principles. So, again, I am Miss Regine F. Ornedo, and I will be your teacher throughout the semester. So, just like we've mentioned in the orientation regarding the subject, the child and adolescent learners and learning principle will be focusing on child and adolescent development with emphasis on current research and theory on biological, we have linguistic, we have cognitive, social, and emotional dimensions of development. So this includes factors that affect the progress of development of the learners and shall include appropriate pedagogical principles applicable for each developmental level. So for today's discussion, we will be talking about the learner-centered psychological principles or the LCP. So because our subject matter talks about the learner centered, we all know and this is very known to us that the learner is the center of the instruction. um the reason why we are studying education or we are teacher right now, it's because of our learners. So meaning that the world of the instruction revolves around the learner. So this discussion introduces you to the 14 learner-centered principles which shall be used throughout our lesson. So this will be our guide in determining appropriate pedagogy for learners at different life stages. So for example, here, may I just um, give you my highlighter. So for example, here in the cognitive and metacognitive factor, it includes here the six principles, while on the other hand, under the motivational and affective factors, we have three principles. In developmental and social factors, we have the two principles, and we have three principles under the individual difference factors, and all in all it covers the 14 learner-centered principles. So the learner-centered psychological principles were put together by the American Psychological Association. So the following 14 psychological principles pertain to the learner and the learning process. So we have different aspects, we have different contexts, and one of that is that the American Psychological Association focused on psychological factors that are primarily internal and under the control of the learner rather than the conditioned habits or the psychological factors. So, however, the principles also attempt to acknowledge not just the internal factors but also the external environment or the contextual factors that interact with the internal factors. Um, the other the other aspects of these 14 principles is that it is intended to deal holistically with learners in the context of the real world learning situation. So they are best understood as an organized set of principles. No principle should be viewed in isolation. So the 14 principles are divided into four, referring to cognitive and metacognitive. We have the motivational and effective, developmental and social, and under the individual difference factors. So the principles are intended to apply to all learners from children to teachers to administrators to parents and to community members involved in our educational system. So to tackle these principles, let's proceed first to the first category, which is the cognitive and metacognitive factors. So number one is we have the nature of learning process. So it says here that the learning of complex subject matter is most effective when it is an intentional process of constructing meaning um, from the information and experience. So there are different types of learning process. So for example, habit formation in motor learning and learning that involves the generation of knowledge, or we can say that cognitive skills and also the learning strategies that the teacher used. Learning in school also emphasizes the use of intentional processes that the students can use to construct meaning from information, experiences, and their own thoughts and beliefs. So, therefore, we can conclude that the successful learners are active, goal oriented, or directed, the self regulating, and we can assume that um, they they have the personal responsibility for contributing to their own learning. Next one is we have the goals of learning process. So it says here that the successful learner over time and with support and instructional guidance can create meaningful, coherent representations of the knowledge. So the strategic nature of learning requires students to be goal directed. So, to construct useful representations of knowledge and to acquire the thinking and learning strategies necessary for continued learning process, um, across the lifespan, the students must generate and pursue personally relevant goals. So the students, for example, the short-term goals and learning may be sketchy in an area, but over time, their understanding can be refined by filling gaps, resolving inconsistency, and deepening their understanding of the subject matter so that they can reach longer term goals. So the responsibility of the educators is to assist the learners in creating meaningful learning goals that are consistent with both personal and educational aspirations and interests. The third one is we have the construction of knowledge. So it says here that the successful learner can link new information with existing knowledge in meaningful ways. So knowledge widens and deepens as students continues to build links between new information and experiences their existing knowledge base. So the nature of these links can take a variety of forms. So for example, such as adding, modifying, or recognizing existing knowledge or skills. So how these links are made or developed may vary in different subject areas, and it may also varies with the student's talents, interests, and abilities. So however, I want you to bear in mind that unless new knowledge becomes integrated with the learner's prior knowledge and understanding, the new knowledge remains isolated. So it cannot be used most effectively in new tasks, and it does not transfer readily to new situations. So what is the responsibility of the educators? So the educators can assist the learners in acquiring and integrating knowledge by a number of strategies that have been shown to be effective with learners of varying abilities, so such as concept mapping and thematic organization or categorizing, if you are familiar with that. We have also the strategic thinking. So the successful learner can create and use a repertoire of thinking and reasoning strategies to achieve complex learning goals. So the successful learners use strategic thinking in their approach to learning, reasoning, or even in a problem solving or in conceptualizing sentences or etc. So they understood or they understand and can use a variety of strategies to help them reach learning and performance goal, and to apply their knowledge in novel situations. So they also can continue to expand their repertoire of strategies by reflecting on the methods they use, which work well for them, or by receiving guided instruction and feedback, and by observing or interacting with appropriate models. So the learning outcomes can be enhanced if the educators assist, of course, learners in developing, applying, and assessing their strategic learning skills. Last, under the cognitive and metacognitive factors, or I mean the last two, is we have the thinking about thinking. So the higher order strategies for selecting and monitoring mental operations facilitate creative and critical thinking. So again, the learners can reflect on how they think and learn. They can also set reasonable learning or performance goals. They can also select potentially appropriate learning strategies or methods, and also they can monitor their progress toward this goals. So in addition to this, the learners also know what to do if a problem occurs, or if they are not making sufficient or timely progress toward a goal. They can generate alternative methods to reach their goal, or much better if they can reassess the appropriateness and the utility of the goal. So we have also here the what we call the instructional methods that focus on helping learners develop these higher order, or we call the metacognitive um, strategies that can enhance in student learning and personal responsibility for learning. So last but not the least, under the cognitive and metacognitive factors, is the principle of the context of learning. So learning is influenced by environmental factors, including culture, technology, and instructional practices. So, I want you to remember that learning does not occur in a vacuum. So, the teachers play a major and interactive role with both the learner and the learning environment. So, there are cultural or group influences to students that can contribute, or that can impact many educationally relevant variables, so such as the motivation, the orientation, the orientation toward learning, and the ways of thinking of your learners. So the technologies also, or the instructional practices also can contribute to the learning process of the students, whether it if your technologies or the instructional practices or materials is appropriate for learners' level of prior knowledge, cognitive abilities, and their learning and thinking strategies. So, the responsibility of the teacher or the educator is to make sure that the class environment, particularly the degree to which it is nurturing or not, or it can also have significant impacts on the student learning. So again, these are the 6 principles under the cognitive and metacognitive factors. So we have the nature of the learning process, we have the goals of learning process, construction of knowledge, we have the strategic thinking, we have the thinking about thinking, and we have the context of learning. So let us now proceed to the motivational and affective factors. So the seventh principle talks about the motivational and emotional influence on learning. So this is what and how much is learned is influenced by the learner's motivation. So motivation to learn in turn is influenced by the individual's emotional states, beliefs, interests, and goals and habits of thinking. So we can consider that the internal world of thoughts, or the beliefs, goals, and expectations are reached for if we can assess the success or failure, if it enhance or interfere with the learner's quality of thinking and information processing. And also, the students' beliefs about themselves as the learners and the nature of learning have a mark of influence on motivation. So, in a motivational and emotional factors also influence both the quality of thinking and information processing, as well as an individual's motivation to learn. If we have the positive emotions, for example, I is curiosity, will generally enhance motivation and facilitate learning and performance. While on the other hand of it, if we have mild anxiety, it can also enhance learning and performance by focusing the learner's attention on a particular task. However, intense negative emotions, so for example, anxiety, we have the panic, we have the insecurities or the related thoughts such as worrying about competence, ruminating about failure, fearing or the punishment of the teachers or the parents, or the stigmatizing levels generally detract from the um, motivation and interfere with learning and contribute to low performance. Next is we have the intrinsic motivation learn. So the learner's creativity, higher order thinking, and natural curiosity all contribute to motivation to learn. Intrinsic motivation is stimulated by tasks of optimal novelty and difficulty, relevant to personal interest, and providing for personal choice and control. So our curiosity or the flexible or the insightful thinking and creativity are major indicators of the learner's intrinsic motivation to learn. So which is in large part a function of meeting basic needs to be competent and to exercise personal control. So when we say intrinsic motivation, it is facilitated on tasks that learners perceive as interesting and personally relevant and meaningful. So appropriate in complexity and difficulty to the learner's abilities and on which they believe they can succeed. The intrinsic motivation also can be facilitated on tasks that are comparable to real world situation and meet needs for choice and control. So the educator must to reach this principle, the educator must encourage and support learners' natural curiosity and motivation to learn by attending to individual differences in learners' perceptions of the optimal novelty and the difficulty, relevance, or even the personal choice and control of the learner. Next is we have the effects of motivation on effort. So acquisition of complex knowledge and skills requires extended learner effort and guided practice. So without learners' motivation to learn, the willingness to exert this effort is unlikely without coercion. So the effort is also another major indicator of motivation to learn. So the acquisition of complex knowledge and skills demands the investment or giving a considerable learner energy and strategic effort, of course, along with the persistence over time. So the educator need to be concerned with facilitating motivation by strategies that enhance learner effort and commitment to learning and to achieving high standards of comprehension and understanding. So, the educator must use effective strategies to facilitate this kind of motivation. So, this may include the purposeful learning activities guided by practices that enhance positive emotions and intrinsic motivation to learn, and the methods that increase learners' perceptions that a task is interesting and personally relevant. So these are the principles under the motivational and effective factors that talks about more on the motivation and the factors that contributed to the motivations of the learners. So we have the motivational and emotional influence on learning, the intrinsic motivation learn, and the effects of motivation on effort. So now let's proceed to the developmental and social factors. So in the 10th principle, we have the developmental influence on learning. So as individuals develop, there are different opportunities and constraints for learning. So learning is most effective when differential development within across physical, intellectual, emotional, and social domains is taken into account. So the individual or every learner or the students learn best when material is appropriate to their developmental level and is presented in an enjoyable and interesting way. So because individual development varies across intellectual, social, emotional, physical domains, or achievement in different instructional domains may also vary. So, overemphasis on one type of developmental readiness, so for example, such as reading readiness, may preclude learners for demonstrating that they are more capable in other areas of the performance. So, the cognitive, emotional, and social development of individual learners and how they interpret life experiences are affected by the prior schooling, home, or the culture and the community factors. So the early and continuing parental involvement in schooling and the quality of language interactions and the two-way communications between adults and children can influence this developmental area. So that is why we always say that the patnubay ng magulang ay mahalaga in the development of our children. So also the awareness and understanding of developmental differences among children with or without emotional, physical, or intellectual disabilities can facilitate the creation of optimal learning context. Next is we have the social influence on learning. So learning is influenced by social interactions, interpersonal relations, and communication with others. So learning also involve or it can be enhanced when the learning has an opportunity to interact and to collaborate with others on instructional tasks. So we can consider also the learning settings. So for example, the learning environment or the classroom that allow for social interactions, and also it involves here the respect diversity, the encourage flexible thinking, and the social competence. So in interactive and the collaborative instructional context, individuals, of course, have an opportunity for perspective taking and reflective thinking that may lead to a higher levels of cognitive, social, moral development, and as well as their self-esteem or their self-confidence. So when our learners or when our children has a quality personal relationships, it can provide them the stability, the trust, the caring, also can increase in learner's sense of belonging, self-respect, and self-acceptance, and it can provide them a positive climate for learning. So I want you to remember also that the influence of the family can contributed also to the as or can contributed or has an impact in his social aspects on learning. So when our children have a positive interpersonal support and instruction in self-motivation strategies can offset factors that interfere with optimal learning, such as negative beliefs about competence in a particular subject, high levels of test anxiety, negative sex role expectations, and undue pressure to perform well. So that is why it is very important if we have a healthy relationship with our children at home. So the positive learning climates also help to establish the concept for healthier levels of thinking, feeling, and behaving. So such contexts help learners feel safe to share ideas, actively participate in the learning process, and create a learning community. So that is why if you have students in the near future that are very shy, very timid, they don't like to share ideas, and they are not sociable, socially incapable. So maybe you might consider looking at his or her family background if your students have a healthy relationship with their parents, with their peers, or etc. So is with that you can start building or train them on how to socially acceptable attitude and etc. After that, developmental and social factors, we have the individual differences factors. So we have the individual differences in learning. So learners have different strategies or approaches and capabilities for learning that are a function of prior experience and heredity. So we have to consider that the individual differences is or are the factors or resulted to heredity or to our environment. So we always say that individuals are born with and develop their own capabilities and talents. So, in addition, through learning and social acculturation, they have acquired their own preferences for how they like to learn and the pace at which they can learn. So, however, these preferences are not always useful in helping learners reach their learning goals. So, this is the responsibility or the role of the teachers or the educators that they need to help students examine their learning preferences and expand or modify them if necessary. So the interaction between the learner differences and curricular and environmental conditions is another key factor affecting learning outcomes. So the teachers or the educators need to be sensitive to individual differences in general. Said they also need to attend to learner perceptions of the degree to which these differences are accepted and adapted to by varying instructional methods and materials. Next is we have the learning and diversity. So learning is most effective when differences in learners' linguistic, cultural, and social backgrounds are taken into account. So the same basic principles of learning, the motivation, and effective instruction apply to all learners. So however, the language, the ethnicity, the race, the beliefs, what else, the socioeconomic status can all influence learning. So careful attention to these factors in the instructional setting enhances the possibilities for designing and implementing appropriate learning environments. So when the learners perceive that their individual differences in abilities, the backgrounds, the cultures, the experiences are valued or respected and accommodated in learning tasks and context, levels of motivations and achievements are enhanced or or achieved in the learner's learning process. So next is we have the standards and assessments. So setting appropriately high and challenging standards and assessing the learner as well as learning progress, including diagnostic process and outcome assessment, are integral parts of the learning process. So the assessment provides important information to both the learner and teacher at all stages of the learning process. So we've discussed this in our assessment aid learning too. So the effective learning takes place when learners feel challenged to work towards appropriately high goals. So therefore, appraisal of the learner's cognitive strength and weaknesses, as well as content knowledge and skills, is important for the selection of current knowledge and skills in the instructional materials of an optimal degree of difficulty. So the ongoing assessment of the learner's understanding of the curricular material can provide variable feedback to both learners and teachers about progress toward the learning goals. So when we use the standardized assessment of learner progress and outcome assessment, it provides one type of assessment information that um that talks about the achievement or the levels both within and across individuals that can inform various types of decisions. So the performance assessment also can provide other sources of information about the attainment of learning outcomes. So it is not just the academic assessment. We also consider the performance assessment, and of course we have also the self-assessment of the learning progress. It can also improve the student's self appraisal skills and enhance motivation and self-directed learning. So these are the principles under the individual differences factors. So we have the individual differences in learning, learning and diversity, and the standards and assessment. So as you can see, the 14 principles is very hard to memorize, very hard um to absorb. That is why according to Alexander and Murphy, they give a summary of 14 principles that that distill them into five areas. So we have the knowledge base. So in the knowledge base, one existing knowledge serves as the foundation of all future learning. So the learner's previous knowledge will influence new learning, specifically on how he represents new information or make associations and filters to new experiences. So we have um, the second one, the strategic processing and control. So the learners can develop skills to reflect and regulate their thoughts and behaviors in order to learn more effectively, or what we call the metacognition. Next is the motivation and affect. So factors such as intrinsic motivation, that is from within, reasons for wanting to learn, or personal goals and enjoyment of learning tasks, all have a crucial role in learning process. That is the motivation and affect. Next is we have the development and individual differences. So learning is a unique journey for each person because each learner has his own unique combination of genetic and environmental factors that influence him. So we've discussed this earlier in the other principles. Next is the situation or the context. So this is the last principles according to Murphy. So learning happens in the context of a society as well as within an individual. So these are the summary of 14 principles. We have the knowledge base, the strategic processing and control. We talk about also the motivation and affect, and also the development and individual differences, and we have the situation or context. So that's all for tonight's discussion. So we've talked only about the LCP, or what we call the learner-centered psychological principles. So we have 14 psychological principles, and we sum it up and distilled into five areas. So the same mechanics, I will send the link of your quiz, and you only have 30 minutes to answer that quiz. So at exactly after 30 minutes, the link will be closed. So better check it out, the time of your submission. So for your lesson 1 activity, so answer the following questions. So this is consists of 40 points. Put your answer in the comment section below by following the format. So again, your name, your block or cluster, and your answer. So the deadline would be on July 4, 2023 until 8 p.m. only. So this is the question. From the module or discussion on learner-centered psychological principles, I realized that. So thank you very much. That's all for tonight's discussion. So I hope you learned something. So again, if you have any questions, you can chat in our official group chat, or you can chat it down in the comment section below, and I will try my best to accommodate your questions. So thank you very much. I hope you learned something, and see you on our next discussion. Thank you and God bless.